We talk about villains on today's episode.
Frank,
Hi, Charles. How are you?
I've got a confession.
What's that?
I've decided to turn to a life of evil.
What makes anything about you evil more so than like last week?
Do you not see the hood over the hat?
That's a fashion crime, sure, but I don't think that's anything else than that.
I would have wore sunglasses, but they reflect too many things.
And that proves how good you are. Welcome to the What is Tabletop podcast. My name's Frank. I'm not evil, canonically. And this is Charles.
That's a lie. Wait, no, I am Charles. He's canonically evil.
So Charles is evil, I'm good. One of us always tells the truth and the other always lies. Who is it?
Could be me.
Anyway, Charles, what are we talking about today?
Today we're going to be talking about villains and how to make them interesting and whatnot for your tabletop pleasures. Wait, I don't like that.
Words are the true villain of this podcast.
I didn't like that at all.
So we're talking about villains, how we make them interesting, both obviously for like flavor and lore reasons and all of that, narrative reasons, all that stuff, but also mechanically because we play a game, and if the final boss fight is a whimper, no one's gonna like it. So we're gonna talk about how we can make those villains mechanically interesting. But before you do that, what should they do, Evil Charles?
Don't like and don't subscribe.
Why is evil to you just the opposite of what they should do? Like in Star Trek,
because the good thing would be to like and subscribe.
Sure.
I don't know.
Charles.
I'm not good at being bad.
You're terrible at being evil. Don't worry, I'm great at it. And so we'll talk about it from my point of view.
Yes, we will. Good guys back. So we're going to be talking about villains and, how to incorporate them into our games to make them interesting and mechanically sound and not duds.
Obviously, when it comes to role-playing games, you are telling a story, and usually that means there's an antagonist that wants to stop the party. The party themselves might be evil, but that doesn't make them villains in their own story.
Right.
Yeah, that's the important caveat.
I was like, what? Wait, that evil villains. It aligns.
Basically, we're talking about like the foils against the narrative of your
Correct.
story and who's going against your protagonist, which is your players. How can you make them interesting, but at the same time also like fun to like root against? You don't want to make it so sad that it's like we want to reform them, all of them, every single time, because then it gets a little boring that way.
So let's talk about just creating the big bad for your campaign. What are some things you should consider?
So the biggest thing, you're going to find a lot of people talking about how to make great villains on the internet, whether it's for writing a book, a movie, playing D&D and stuff like that. And you're going to have a lot of different advice. And here's the thing. There's one piece of advice that I want to talk about right now and just nip it in the butt. Your villains do not need to have a compelling backstory that make them super sympathetic. That's not necessarily what always makes a good villain. Darth Vader is not sympathetic. He murdered a bunch of people, and people love Darth Vader. And yeah, you can make the argument, but Anakin's sympathetic. No, he's not. He's never sympathetic. He's just an idiot.
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but continue.
Well, let's talk about the Joker, who definitely never has a sympathetic backstory.
And I do agree with that.
And he is one of the most popular villains of all time. And he's just pure chaos, right? You can have people like Vandal Savage or Darkseid or Thanos. These people don't have sympathetic backstories. Sure, they made the one in the MCU, Thanos, have a sympathetic.
I was like, Thanos didn't MCU did.
But that's not even sympathetic. His sympathetic backstory is, I had a theory that we should murder half of people, and they were saying no because that's mean, and now I'm going to prove them wrong. That's not sympathetic.
There's more to it than that, but okay.
No, I'm pretty sure that's all it was. He had a theory. Like, his people were dying off because they overpopulation. He said murder them all. They said no. His people died off. Like,
well, again, maybe I'm thinking of the comic book version of Thanos. Like, Thanos definitely had some background issue as to why the way he was.
Regardless, it doesn't always have to be that. And even if they do, like, your party doesn't care that much. So that's probably the hottest take. Yeah. Get that at the front of the video. Sure. Here's the thing about villains. Just make characters that go against your players. Whatever your players' goals, make something that opposes them. That's going to be it. You can have them be sympathetic. You can have them not be sympathetic. I've had several friends who like it when I have a pure evil bad guy who's doing things for the sake of pure evil. Because it's fun sometimes to have that.
Yeah, it's the classic good versus evil thing. I know my dad's very much like that. He wants the good guys to win, the bad guys to fail. And when you have sympathetic bad guys, it's like, oh, well, he was just doing this for his family. Yeah. Oh, you don't want to feel bad for the bad guy because then it makes
not always.
Not always. Again, I like having complex characters, like complex bad guys, But I also like having bad guys who are just bad. They're
Mhm.
just I'm like the Joker. Like, I'm doing this because this is what I want to do. No one's gonna stop me from doing this because I'm a crazy son of a gun.
Yeah, and those people exist in the real world. So if
yeah.
you're like, it's not realistic, that's also wrong.
That's completely
And
wrong.
so just, I think what people like about a villain is not necessarily like being sympathetic or having a tragic backstory or anything like that. It's having clear motivation. What is it that
Yes.
the villain is doing? Because if it's just like, I'm the big bad evil wizard that the party has to take down. Why? Because he's the big bad evil wizard. That's not as interesting as, I'm the big bad evil wizard. Oh, why do we have to stop him? Because if you don't, the world will cease to exist. And like, sure, that's a very simple and generic way to do it, but it gives you stakes. It gives you some understanding.
No, absolutely. Like, with villains that are just out there to create chaos and create, they're going against the protagonist because that just doesn't align with what they want. They want to do what they want to do.
I love the whole, like, here's a big bad evil that's existed for however long and is super powerful, and the only reason they want to get rid of the party is because they're just in the way.
Yeah.
That's a really cool, and then like the party keeps getting in their way and they're like, like there's a slow respect that's gained against the good guys, and then the good guys inevitably defeat them, and it's like,
Correct.
all right, now let me actually go full out. And there's some fun in that. My first D&D campaign to go from level 1 to 20, I had the villain introduced in the first campaign session. He was introduced and I was expecting them to kill him, and what ended up happening is the party let him go, and he said, cool, you're gonna regret doing that. And so what was the stakes? He's gonna destroy the continent that they're on, and he's gonna reshape it in his image, yada yada. But to them, it's like, we are the reason he's doing that. We could have stopped him and we didn't. We need to stop him now, right? That's the stakes, is we're cleaning up our mistake. That's awesome. That's super fun. I thought about giving him a more compelling backstory and being like, well, actually, he's just tragically misunderstood, and what he thinks he's doing is doing right. And I'm like, no, who cares? Like, it's much more interesting that the party's just like, we unleash this evil entity onto the world. We need to stop him because it's our fault.
And sometimes your party, your the people you have set this game up for, will give you the backstory of that villain. Maybe you don't have a backstory for this villain, and then all of a sudden you have a character who's like, oh, maybe this is why this character's doing this.
So there was one campaign where a player was playing a half vampire, and in my lore, there's a specific vampire who's like based off of Vandal Savage. Basically, he's existed for all millennia, and he has a bunch of children, this and that. And then I started to notice like a certain tragedy in each backstory, and I'm like, what if he is the reason, like that big bad caused all of these small events to happen? And so as like the party doesn't realize they're all connected to him until he reveals himself halfway through the campaign, and he's like, by the way, oh, you look familiar. Oh, you must have been the person whose wife I killed to see if I can create a bioweapon. Oh, you are interesting because you are clearly the person who got like caught up in that avalanche, and I was just trying to see if I could find a new place for my castle, right? It's this guy who has bigger plans than anyone ever knows, and the party just gets swept up into it, and they're like, oh, now we got personal stakes involved. It's like, again, he's just being evil. Like, he's like, I don't care. I can live forever. I can't die.
Yeah.
So who cares about being good? And the party's like, we care because you murdered our friends. Or you murdered our family.
Yeah, and sometimes I'm necessarily evil, just selfish.
Yes. Oh, 100%.
Not that that's not necessarily an evil thing, but I think that's what makes it, to me, a compelling villain, is making them so unaware of their surroundings. Like, their thoughts and ideas are so much bigger than, like, the person that you were attached to that they murdered, or you got caught up in this tragic accident. My plans as the villain are so much greater and so much more beyond your insignificant thoughts.
Right.
I love that kind of stuff because it drives the characters. Like, I can imagine how, like, my character getting super angry, like knowing
you think my life means nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I think it makes the victory over the villain that much sweeter too.
Here's the thing too. You can have more complex villains. I'm not saying don't have them. You just need to be careful, because if that's all you ever do, it's not going to be as interesting. It's not going to be as fun. I think the best way to do this is to have a combination of, you have villains who are just in it for pure chaos, but then you also have the Machiavellian villains who are like, you don't understand how complex my web of deceit and lies goes. But then you also have the ones who are like tragic villains who are like, I'm only here because I'm forced to be. I don't have a choice in the matter.
Right.
And then you can have the villains where it's like, I could be good, but I'm evil right now, and then maybe I'll be good later, and then maybe I won't, and then having a good mix of them is really what's important and what keeps things fresh. Biggest thing you can do is steal from other sources of media and then just tweak it a little bit. Like I said, I ripped off Vandal Savage for one of my vampires, and to me that made him so much more interesting. And I was just like, why? Like, it makes sense. The first guy to become a vampire gains immortality. What is the natural conclusion of what he's going to do? He's seen so much destruction. He's seen like the peak of civilization and then its fall. How is he going to act? He's going to be like, I'm just going to keep doing things and trying experiments and just seeing if I can make the world into my image or not as a somewhat mortal being.
I think villains who justify their actions, even knowing they're evil, are even fascinating myself. Yeah, we're going to enslave this group of people, but these group of people we've been at war with forever, and they enslaved my ancestors thousands of years ago, so now it's our turn to reign over them. Things like that.
I do like the villains who it's like, oh, they're doing something evil, and then you have a conversation with them, and they're like, oh no, I understand their point of view. Yeah. those are really fun.
I guess it's kind of a sympathetic villain, but I'm going more with like, this is clearly two wrongs don't make a right type thing. It's like this, what they're doing is clearly evil, and you know it's evil, but you understand like their perspective on it.
Conversely, you can have, like what you said, villains who don't look at themselves that way, but because of the circumstances they're in, that's what makes them a villain, right? Without getting into anything real world related, you can have two warring nations going at each other, both of them justified in their own opinions, and both be villainous because of the actions they're taking in that war, right? These are the kind of things you can do where it's like, all right, you have to choose a side in this war. It's like, well, both of them suck. It's like, both of them do suck. What side do you choose? Because one of them is going to have to give and one of them is going to have to take. So, for example, in Critical Role, in their second campaign, they had this empire and they had this dynasty, and they were going to war with each other. And at first, it did seem like that's where Matt was going, where it's like, both of them kind of suck. Both sides have their issues. One is being a terrorist to the other. The other is like pushing in and enslaving on their territory. And so it's like neither side is doing a good job. But then as the campaign went on, it was like, well, actually, no, the Kryn dynasty is actually the good guys and they're being mistreated by the other people and they just want their holy relics back. And it's like, well, that's not as interesting as the fact that both of them were like doing evil things. And again, it's possible Matt still had deeper complexity and that's just where the way the story went out. But it did feel more like as the party went one side, that side became the good side, and then the other side was actually evil all along. Yeah. And I would have been more interested to see, like, no, both sides suck. Do you try to help the side that you think you can reform? Do you just let it go on and then have some fun with that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's important for your players to have to make those tough moral decisions. By making those tough moral decisions, again, it really reflects on your villains. It makes your villains look like they're people, because villains are people.
And another thing to do, make sure your villains have like a somewhat interesting personality. That interesting personality could be stoicism, where they just have no expressions, like they have no emotion, but it's interesting, right? There's something about them that's different than everything else, right? Obviously, you can have the big evil, like sinister, like, hello, I'm so evil, aren't I? And that could be fun for a few of them. Yeah. But if they're all like that, it's like, gee, I wonder who's the bad guy. Is it you? No, it could possibly be me. Unless that's the twist.
I like the over emotional villains who are just like, everything is important. You know, every moment of their existence needs to stand for something. Like, no, I have to be right about everything. Like, there's that over the top.
I like the hyper intelligent villains who are like, no. Let me talk down to you very quickly. You don't understand what's going on in this game. You are not even a pawn. You are the space that the pawn is on. That's how insignificant you are, right? Like the metaphors they use, stuff like that can be very interesting. So like personality traits, if it's just something simple, like it could be an accent where it's like, or a voice, something like that, where it's like you can hear how they're different, but you need something to set them apart. So then that way where it's like the man with 6 fingers walks in and you're like, I know that guy. That's my villain. He's from my backstory. Right. Like we all remember the 6-fingered man from Princess Bride, but like, can you tell me anything else about him other than his 6 fingers and he killed Inigo Montoya's dad? No, but that's all he needed to do. He just needed to be a jerk.
That's all we needed to know as the viewer was that's a bad guy.
Also, mind your characters' backstories. Mind your players' backstories. Because they will give you villains without you even realizing it. Sometimes it's very obvious. Like, for example, with Charles, where he gave me Madame Dollface. Yeah. And I was like, great, I'm using this at some point. she's going to be evil, and I just know that she wants she wants Ambrose back.
Yeah.
She wants your character back under her control. That's all I need to know. And so we got a motivation. We got something unique about her. She's a creepy, doll-faced person.
Yeah.
And she will do anything to get him back. Like, that's all we needed to know. We got all those things from him.
Yeah, and this all started with my lack of love for dolls and
Right.
porcelain dolls and like marionettes and stuff like that. I'm not into those things.
Conversely, you can have people who are like, in the same campaign, our friend Zach Dunkerton played a character who was experimented by mind flayers. And I'm like, well, how convenient. I wanted mind flayers to be a villain. So now I just tie you into the backstory of the main villains, right? Having those ways of tying in these seeds and these things with your players' backstories also makes them feel like they were involved in the story. Where it's like, our actions, my character, is part of the reason we're fighting this thing. Isn't that fun? Isn't that cool that like I got to have an influence on this? In my first long-term campaign, Brett's character, he's like, I'm one of 3 angels of this god. We all came down. My friend, one of the other angels, abandoned us, and I'm here to find him. And I'm like, that's an easy villain to have.
That's cool.
And what I got to do with that is like, okay, if Brett's playing this angel who's looking for his friend, and he's like, once I tell him that our God loves him and wants him back, he'll come back. I'm like, well, then what's more interesting than an angel who doesn't want to come back? He's like, no, I hate you. I don't care. I'm staying here and I'm going to do evil because screw that guy. Like, he left me for dead. Who cares about your God? And that brought up an interesting foil, right? You can have players who give you the villain's backstory, but they don't give you the personality or like the traits or anything like that. You take that and you mine it, right?
Yeah.
We had technically a villain with, again, back to the pirate campaign, where Zach Brooks was playing Valeri, and he had this basically like rival.
Oh,
right,
yeah.
with Jorthis,
Yeah.
who would show up every so often, and he was a jabber. Like, he was meant to be defeated constantly, but he was a villain who kept reoccurring, and he was like, I challenge you, Valeri. I want a wizard duel now, and you will fight me, right? Like, he's that kind of a character.
Yeah.
And the fact that I could just say Valeri out of nowhere, and he'd be like, oh dear God, it's him again, right?
We were all that way. We were like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. And then ironically, you ended up recruiting him because Valeri turned evil, which was a really fun dichotomy and stuff like that.
Oh yeah. That's always fun when and there's another villain, a way to get a villain, having a player character turn into the big bad, or at least going over to the big bad side.
I played so many games in the same world that now I have villains who were previous player characters. And so if I ever have a campaign happen and that villain ends up coming into play, you best believe I'm going to text that previous player and be like, hey, here's what's happening in the campaign. What would you like to do? That can be really fun. Now, if it's a player character who becomes a villain in the campaign that they're playing, I recommend taking them aside and being like, hey, are you fine with me taking your like, you're going to roll a new character. I'm going to take that character and I'm going to do what I think this character is going to do. I can ask for your opinion, but for the sake of the story, for the sake of you not knowing, I'm taking this thing. Are you okay with that? The specific case of Zach Brooks, I did show him, I'm like, this is where it's going to lead. And he's like, that's so cool. Okay, yeah, done.
Yeah.
And he was like, cool. And Zach was really good about not metagaming, so that's why I showed him a little bit. But being able to take it apart instead of him being like, okay, now I get to play the character in the wings and this and that. And ironically, the entire time he was like, well, maybe we can reform Valeri. And I was like, bud, there's no reforming this guy. I mean, maybe at the end when you're fighting him as a big boss battle, but there's nothing else there.
Yeah. Overall, I believe a villain needs to be a threat to the world at large.
Yeah, or at the very least, just the players.
Yeah.
Yeah, there needs to be some reason that villain keeps coming up. And again, that villain's threat level could be 1 out of 10, where it doesn't mean anything, right? You're just a little speck that keeps coming back, but you keep coming back. And so that's the threat is this guy won't stop showing up.
Yeah.
And again, that's the important thing too.
I think you could also grow that character into more of a, like over time.
Now we're also going to talk about how you can implement the villains. We're going to talk about it first narratively, and then we'll talk about it mechanically. Narratively speaking, you should know how long you expect that villain to be in there. If you're the kind of people who do campaign long arcs and stuff like that, you need to know, is this villain a short-term villain that's only around for the next few sessions? Are they a longer-term villain that's maybe around for a good chunk of the campaign? Or are they the final boss and maybe they should be around the entirety of it? We're going to go into that a little bit.
So let's talk about the short-term villains.
Yeah, so these are going to be you walk into a new town and the blacksmith's daughter has been kidnapped by a bunch of goblins. And you go to find the goblins' hideout, and there's a hobgoblin who they've named King. And from there's your villain. It's the hobgoblin, the main goblin, the king goblin, if you will. His name could be Jared, and he could have some magical balls that he just swishes around a lot and sings magic dance all the time. Or it could just be a hobgoblin. Whatever you want to do. I'm not going to tell you how you should have Derry Bowie be in your campaigns, but that's how I would do it.
That's how he would do it.
This is a very short-term villain where he shows up for a little bit and they're just there to like be an obstacle, be a roadblock. Yeah, you can give them some personality. You can have them be there, but like that, you don't have to do a lot of work with those guys. Conversely, the longer, like a little bit longer term villains, these are ones that like you can allude to a little bit, right? Or these could be surprise villains where it's like, oh, we thought the mayor was on our side, but it turns out he's evil the whole time. What? That's so surprising. But the important part is the longer you have a villain in your campaigns, the more your players should know about them, right? If you have a big bad evil guy who's pulling the strings from behind, in the dark the whole time, when they finally reveal themselves, it could feel like you just gave us a villain at the last possible second.
That's right.
Yeah, it's like, oh, it was this guy we've never heard of before. He was the one pulling the strings the whole time. Isn't that really cool and satisfying? It's not.
I know I was in the process of making my own D&D campaign a while back where the villain was kind of like I don't want to say multiversal, but it was like it had something to do with the secret city. Like there was a secret city that no one could ever find, and they were gathering power and stuff like that. And there were just like little breadcrumbs I was going to leave around the world for my players to find of it, to kind of eventually they'll find out the name, and then eventually they'll find out more about it, and then eventually they'll realize what the true threat of this villain is.
Yeah, and you got to be careful about how you lead those breadcrumbs because you can think, oh, I'm making very obvious clues, and the other players could be like, oh, that doesn't mean anything unless you have that moment where it all connects together. It doesn't matter how well seated it was if they just get to the end, they're like, oh, who's this guy? Right. Oh, who cares about him? Oh, he's just this big final boss. Who cares? Yeah. You could also conversely have, like, let's say there's this kingdom you're fighting against, and the king is going to be your big bad evil guy of the final campaign. Having people report to him or talk of him in such ways, right? Yeah. Maybe you have a villain that the party really connects to and really hates, and the way he looks at the villain, the way they look at the villain, and they're like subservient the entire time, where they're saying, like, in revelry, how much they care for the villain, how much they care for this king, how much they're putting their effort into him, right? That could be interesting, right? You can have this very strong villain that gets killed by another villain, and then, like, that could be interesting too. But ultimately, you want to seed in there, right? I honestly recommend, at least once, if you haven't done it before, have your final villain show up in the first session, right? And literally have it be like, this is the final villain. Here they are. Now, I also recommend then having some way for them to not die immediately. Even if that's just like them dying is part of their plan, cool. But like having some means for them to keep coming back.
You kind of mentioned this or alluded to this a little bit. Having a villain show up at the very end, like, your party's chasing this villain the entire time. And then you get to that final fight, and then a bigger, badder villain shows up, destroys them. You're like, just
you have to be very careful.
Pure party shock.
You have to be very careful how you do that.
Yeah.
If it's something like the villain is about to unleash the Tarrasque, right, where it's like this is this big entity that we've heard of for like it's famous amongst D&D players. Like you don't want to fight the Tarrasque, and then the villain is like, I'm going to unleash the Tarrasque, and then they do, and then the Tarrasque immediately kills the villain. That could be interesting because you've built up the boss, the actual thing. You built up the Tarrasque. Right.
Okay,
so like that's what you would want to do. You don't want it to be like, I'm the big villain, you build him up, and then suddenly this other guy comes and kills him, and it's like, oh, okay, who cared about that guy? I guess
or even having like warring villains where you killed off the one villain to help out another.
But that's interesting, right? That's a little more interesting. You got to be careful about. It's all about where you place your emphasis. If you're placing it on one guy and then he just gets thrown away at the end for this other person that you've never heard of before. It's like, who cares?
Yeah, but at this point, I guess at that point, the party would have heard about both of them. Like the party was working for the villain type thing,
right? Because ultimately, if you can't have a narrative reason your players are invested in killing this person, it doesn't matter what mechanics you put in there. It doesn't matter. But let's talk about mechanics anyway.
We have not touched on mechanics yet. So, what mechanically makes a villain?
They just have magic powers that...
Just magic powers.
Yeah, no, I mean, it doesn't matter. It's whatever system you're playing. You have a stat block and your party fights against it. That's really what matters. Now, what I like to do with my villains is occasionally giving them like game-breaking rules where it's like, oh, this is normally, let's say you can only cast 3 spells a day. Well, he can cast 17 if this is the final boss, obviously.
Right, yeah.
But like you want to do like something mechanically that sticks out about this villain. It could be a puzzle where it's like, you hit him in the arm and his arm falls off. Yeah. And you're like, okay, that's interesting. All right, next round, 2 arms grow in its place. It's like, what? He has Hydra limbs? How are we going to stop this guy?
Yeah.
Right. And then you make it about the importance of calling your shots. So like you can find a mechanic in your game that either exists or you think should exist and you add it in and you can make a villain around that for sure.
I know something that Dungeons & Dragons does. They do the legendary resistance, the legendary actions.
Depending on... Obviously, at what point they're introduced should determine how strong they are. Ultimately, you want the villains to be slightly stronger than the heroes, so that way it feels like a challenge, right?
Right.
But you don't want every villain ever. You want some easy creatures so the party feels like they can do stuff. But then you want the villain, whether it's an arc villain, whether it's a short-term or long-term campaign villain, you want them to feel like a challenge. Because if you just show up, we can talk so much about the times that campaigns end with a whimper because the final bad guy was too easy to fight.
Right.
Critical Role does this too, where like their final boss fight is just another fight. Like there's nothing different about it. Matt Colville has a great video on how he would have run Vecna if he was in Matt Mercer's spot. Matt Mercer's running Vecna and he implies at the beginning that he has multiple 9th level spells. Isn't that crazy? Because he's a god. And then he never does anything else with that. And then Matt Colville's like, well, he's the god of secrets, right? You know what he should do? He should make it to where one spell doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, wow.
And it's like, cool, I crossed off that spell. It doesn't exist. You don't have access to that spell anymore. That's the kind of thing you should be thinking about with like your end level villains. So for example, in our pirate campaign, where Valeri became this entity, I had alluded to this type of metal that can absorb magic and do really cool things with magic throughout the campaign. And then you guys stopped going after that plot line. And I'm like, who wouldn't? Valeri.
Yeah.
So he made this body for himself that was impervious to all damage. Doesn't matter how, like, what you do, he can't take any damage. And so then the party's like, we have to figure out how the heck to get him out of this.
Right.
And if the party had done research, which none of y'all did, you could have eventually figured it out. But instead, in combat, I had 3 means of being able to basically crack his shell of his perfect armor. It was like he had to do 100 damage with 1 strike, which Jeffrey did easily. You had to be. It was like certain spells could give you access temporarily to being able to reshape the armors, and then there was some third option I couldn't remember off the top of my head.
I think it's important too to have multiple ways to bring down a villain. If there's only one way and you're expecting your players to figure it out, again, we've all been there where the party's been defeated by a door or a child's puzzle. And it's not to insult the players.
Sometimes you just have bad dice rolls. Sometimes it's just people not thinking.
Exactly. I know that I would want multiple ways to bring down a bad guy. It can't just be like, there's only one way to take this guy out.
Right.
And then, because if you don't have that, or if you haven't done the research, you're going to die. You're basically building, at that point, you're just building a new party.
Yeah.
So
I also recommend, and you can steal this from video games, multi-level boss fights.
Yes.
Right. So in the
this is in my final form.
100%. Yeah. Like, that's what we did, right? So you guys were able to crack his armor. You pulled him out, and you're like, all right. We're pinning him down. We're making sure this attack hits. Yeah. And I'm like, cool. His contingency goes off. All these things happen. He disappears. And then it became like, wait, this wasn't the final fight. I'm like, oh, you fools, no. And so you had to find him. Yep. You tracked him down only to have him be in this god body that, again, I had been alluding to the entire campaign. Yeah. See the importance of these things, right? All these plot points that I had been bringing up, I had been alluding to. And so he's in the god body. And now it's like, crap, we have to fight a dead god.
And players, this is why you take notes. Take notes.
Yeah. And if they had taken notes, they might have been able to have an easier time fighting the god, because he had things like what was it, mass disintegration?
Yeah. Oh gosh.
Which, because you guys like rushed to it, that power wasn't as strong as if you had like waited a few in-game months and like gathered more resources. It was like basically disintegration, but he could split the damage amongst multiple targets.
Yeah.
If the god body had more time to develop, it would have been the ability to cast disintegration once and target multiple people, dealing the amount of damage to all of them.
Wow.
Stuff like that's really fun to do. And I could do that because it's the final fight. Like, if your character dies in the final fight, that's fine because it's the final fight.
Yeah.
Right? And then we had a very interesting moment too afterwards where I gave everybody a choice and all these other things. But that's for a different conversation of end game level things. But mechanically speaking, having multiple ways to fight the boss, having them be something that is just different, right? I've had multiple final bosses that were impervious to all damage, and the way the party went about defeating them was different. One was literally the invulnerable spell, so it's like, okay, can we find a way to get rid of that spell? And then one was, oh, he has a shell of a body. Is there a way we can get him out of that? Right. You can do the same thing more than once and have different mechanical ways to get around it.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Just think about it. Steel. We have multiple different resources. So we have the Tome of Beasts. That is great. These are all for 5th edition, unfortunately. But these resources are great, even to just give you ideas for other games and other systems to be like, oh, I liked this mechanic. How would this mechanic work in Traveler? Or it's like, how would this mechanic work in Lancer? Let me try it out. And the beauty is, it doesn't have to be balanced because it's a one-time thing. Once that boss is dead, you could be like, wow, that was underpowered. I can't do that again. Or, wow, that was too strong. Never do that again.
Yeah. That's the thing, too. It's always tough, especially with 5th edition. We've talked about it before, where sometimes the bad guys either go down way too easily or the players go down way too easily. It's really about finding that balance because, again, you want your players to feel like they accomplished something. I know I don't want to get to the end of the big bad and happen like that. Like that would be very
3 combat sessions and it's like 3 rounds and we're good.
Yeah. No, I want something that's going to last a little while, and I like the idea of having multiple forms or multiple stages of a fight. Having them escape or something just to fight another day. I'm okay with stuff like that. I also don't want it to be where it seems impossible. Like there's no way we're going to beat this guy. Unless it's like, again, at the beginning of the campaign where it's like you start off at a 20 level and then you die only to create a new character because the heroes couldn't take out this big bad.
That actually would be a very interesting way to do it, where it's like you made the most broken characters, they all died, and now you have new level characters who have to rise up, and you're like, but these guys didn't win. It's like, yeah, how do you win? Oh, I don't know.
You do things differently.
Could be very interesting for sure. Yeah. So when it comes to villains, just making sure you have a narratively focused reason for them. Like their goals are clear. There's something unique about them, and then just mechanically there's also something interesting about them. These are the big things that are going to keep your players engaged and be like, how did you make that? And again, stealing things is perfectly fine, especially if your players don't know you're stealing things. Oh boy, right?
Oh, yeah.
You could have a villain who's like, the only people who could deal damage to me are people who didn't spend money on magic potions because I have the ability to tap into that or something. I don't know. Figure out the exact reason on your own. That's what your game is for, not for me. But you can have stuff like that. It's really, really fun for sure.
So, let us know how you make your villains. Tell us what's important about villains to you in your game. Maybe we missed something. Let us know in the comments.
Yes. But now, Charles.
Oh.
I'm the evil one. Mwahaha. Oh, he's just disappearing. Okay. Oh, well, he's just going to get his drink. Stay witty. Because Charles won't.